Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
The good kind of Islamophobe. Quite an interesting title, but that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit on the show today, because our guest is what he says, the good kind of Islamophobe. And the topic we're going to be discussing on the show today is, do Islamists or Islamist groups have anything to do with the rioting going on American city streets? Our guest today wrote recently an article which stated that we haven't seen political violence like this in America since the Civil War. In this article, our guest stated that the political violence in the USA today is careening towards a second civil war. How so? And who is behind it? We have heard about Black Lives Matter and Antifa, but what about the Islamic agenda and America's enemies, namely Iran? Are they involved in it? Very interesting questions. Is Islamic money and support behind the radical left chaos that we're seeing on American streets today? That's what we're going to be talking about on the show. I can't wait. It's very, very interesting. I know that in some of these marches we have seen, and some of the violence, we have seen attacks on churches. We have seen people who are taking their families into church harassed and yelled at, saying, don't go in there, don't bring your kid in that building, et cetera, et cetera. Churches have been attacked as well. And of course, synagogues and Jews, and the anti-Semitism is coming up. Honk if you believe Jews are creating race wars. Things like that is what we're seeing. Attacks against synagogues and Jewish institutions, burning them down, arsons, etc. So we're going to be talking about all of this. What does it have to do with what's happening in America right now? Who is behind it? We'll be right back, everybody. Don't go anywhere. You're listening to the Tamar Yonah Show here on Israel News Talk Radio.
שלום, אתם מקשיבים ל-Israel News Talk Radio.
G'day, I'm Jono Vandor.
And I'm Ross Nichols.
Join us on our program, Israel on My Mind, a show that broadcasts all the weekly goodness that flows like milk and honey from the Holy Land straight into your ears with humorous and happy news stories.
New shows are posted every Thursday at 7 p.m. Israel time, highlighting the lighter side and advancing a positive view of Israel here on Israel News Talk Radio.
The good kind of Islamophobe. And that's what our guest says he is. And the question that we're asking today that we're going to really hone in on is, do Islamists or Islamic groups have anything to do with the rioting going on American city streets? Our guest today wrote recently an article which stated that we haven't seen political violence like this in America since the Civil War. He stated that the political violence in the USA today is careening toward a second civil war. And my question is, how so, and who is behind it? Our guest is Robert Spencer. He's an American anti-Muslim author, blogger on one of the key figures of the counter-jihad movement. Robert Spencer describes himself as, quote, the good kind of Islamophobe, and comments on radical Islam. He's published books. 2 are on the New York Times bestseller list, and he's here joining us on the show today. So welcome to the show, Robert Spencer.
Thank you. I got to say, the introduction is from Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a venomous propaganda site that tells numerous lies, and I am not anti-Muslim. It is not anti-Muslim to oppose jihad violence and Sharia oppression of women. It is actually pro-Muslim to do that. It's no more anti-Muslim to oppose jihad terror than it is anti-German to oppose Nazism. The Wikipedia bio is viciously biased, and I'm sorry, I didn't know you were going to use it, or I would have referred you to the bio at my website. It's also the same thing with the whole term Islamophobe. Islamophobe is a smear propaganda term that is designed to intimidate people into thinking there's something wrong with opposing jihad violence and that same Sharia oppression. When I said that I was the good kind of Islamophobe, I'm speaking ironically in the sense of this, that I oppose jihad mass murder. I oppose the idea that women should not have equality of rights because they are women. I oppose the inherent anti-Semitism of Islamic doctrine and many other things that every decent person should oppose. And yet I'm accused of Islamophobia. If that's Islamophobia, then the whole world should be Islamophobic. Then everyone should be an Islamophobe. That is the point.
Okay, thank you very much for correcting your intro. I appreciate that, and I want to get everything right. All right, very good. All right, so with that, we're seeing today, Robert, on the streets of many major American cities, and even spreading to other places now, rioting, looting, and even anti-Semitism and anti-Christianity activities taking place with the attacking churches, attacking Jewish institutions as well. Just recently, just for the Jewish people, because we're broadcasting here from Israel and it interests our listeners, there was a signs on an LA freeway saying that the Jews the Jews want a race war, and honk if you know that this is true. Basically, that's what they're saying. And very disappointedly, there were some horns honking on this video that we watched. So we're seeing this is really bleeding out into other areas of life that is not just about George Floyd being killed by a policeman. So with all of this happening, where would you like to take us?
Well, this is very important to know that there is rising anti-Semitism in the United States and in Europe. And unfortunately, most of the analyses of it focus exclusively on the rise of the so-called far right and white supremacists. The influence of such people and the numbers of such people are vastly exaggerated beyond all proportion. You do have a tiny a tiny group of nuts here and there, but the idea that the anti-Semitism that we do see all over the place comes from them is completely not based on fact. The anti-Semitism comes from the rising rates of Islamic migration, mass Muslim migration into the United States and into Europe. And, of course, the leftists who ally with those groups and are increasingly adopting their perspectives. When you come to the riots in the United States today with Antifa and Black Lives Matter, there is a long-standing alliance between them and jihad groups. As far back as January 2015, there's a far-left publication called Countercurrent News, and it reported, and I quote, "Recently, a number of representatives from the Dream Defenders, Black Lives Matter, and various Ferguson anti-police brutality protesters made history through a solidarity trip to Palestine," where it says that they were exploring the link between oppression emanating from the Israeli state, as well as that which victims of police brutality are experiencing in America. And Ahmed Abuznaid of Dream Defenders said, "The goals were primarily to allow for the group members to experience and see firsthand the occupation, ethnic cleansing, and brutality Israel has levied against Palestinians, but also to build real relationships with those on the ground leading the fight for liberation. I could go on and on about this. It's very clear that these groups were completely harmonious, and we see many other connections between groups such as the Radical Student Campus Group, the Students for Justice in Palestine, and these far-left groups that are agitating and rioting. I think one of the most noteworthy and striking examples of that is Uruj Rahman, a Palestinian Arab lawyer in New York City, who was actually arrested during the riots in New York City for throwing a Molotov cocktail into a police car and trying to, obviously, to set it on fire. Uruj Rahman has written many times harshly critical of Israel and retailing Palestinian jihad propaganda. And she is clearly also, of course, a foremost exponent of the international left. And these two forces have very much come together in the recent unrest in the United States.
You know, maybe you can answer this question for me, Robert. You know, you would think that the radical left and Hollywood, etc., would not be embracing Islam, the PLO and Hamas, Islam, which generally, as we've seen in its truest form, I believe, is doesn't give women equal rights. We see what's going on in Saudi Arabia, although that's loosening things up over there. They're pro PLO and Hamas. They're against Israel, which is the tolerant and democratic state in the Middle East. It's tolerant to gays. It gives religious freedom. It has freedom of the press, something that you won't find necessarily in these Islamic countries. And yet the radical left and even just the regular good, liberal left, people who love everybody would be embracing something like this. And I mean, I don't understand that. Maybe you can explain it.
Well, the left is increasingly open about its anti-Americanism. The statues being toppled is an indication that the left's perspective nowadays is to is the left's goal, I should say, is to make Americans ashamed of being American, to make us hate our own country and heritage, to make us think that our heroes and the people who have been celebrated in these monuments are evil people. And instead of standing up against this and trying to give these people a sense of history and a sense of reality, all too many leaders, both on the left and on the right for that matter, have caved in. And some statues, even one of Abraham Lincoln in Boston, they've been taken down, not because they were toppled by these mobs, but because elected officials were buying into the view of the mob. So anti-Americanism is rampant today on the left, and of course, the Islamic Jihad is likewise dedicated to trying to destroy the United States as the foremost exponent of a system of government that is the rival globally to their vision of societies governed by Islamic law.
Okay, but Robert, what's so attractive? America. What's so attractive about the left wanting to team up? Be pro PLO, pro Hamas, pro accepting everything about Islam that is against American values.
Well, here again, it's because of the shared hatred. They both hate America. They both hate the Judeo-Christian tradition. They both also hate Israel for the same kind of reason, because they're socialist internationalists. Now, of course, I know that socialists played a big role in the founding of Israel, but it is a national state, the national home for the Jewish people. And as such, leftist internationalists hate it because they want to have no borders, no national distinctions, but one global international Marxist state. And consequently, they have no problem allying with jihad groups like Hamas and others as well, because they too want to destroy Israel, of course, just as much as they want to destroy the United States, and establish also an international order, in their case based on Islamic law, Sharia, rather than on Marxist internationalism. But it's both. They both share a vision of a totalitarian state that is international and that stamps out all dissent. So they see each other as ideological kin.
I'm just trying to figure out, besides their having in common their hatred of America and faith and family, besides that, what do they have in common? But when we get back, we'll talk more about that. We're going to be taking a break now here at Israel News Talk Radio for some promos and ads. And when we get back, we'll be talking about this, as well as, will there be indeed a civil war, a second civil war in America? We'll be right back.
Hi, everyone. This is Andrea Simento from Jerusalem, inviting you to drop everything and join me on my show, Pull Up a Chair. We'll visit this week's quirky stories, meet fabulous guests, and discover my Israel. Together, we'll laugh, shout, and explain the topics that make us say, hey, we've got to talk about that. So get comfortable and pull up a chair with me, Andrea Simento, every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Did you know this psalm and many others were composed by a Jewish shepherd and musician who later became a king? Would you like to know some of the inner meanings of psalms to help you connect with God and strengthen your soul? An exciting and easy-to-read book is now available which will help you do just that. Software for the Soul, Psalms for Everyone, available on Kindle, Audible, and Amazon.com. Software for the Soul.
Modesty at the beach? It isn't just about body image. It's about feeling good. Modest swimsuits, so we don't get burned by the sun.
So we won't get ogled by strangers.
So we'll feel free to express ourselves without the need to expose ourselves.
Let Marcy Modest help you to cover up what you want, how you want.
Made in Israel. Visit marcymodest.com. That's MARSEA modest.com.
And get a 10% discount on your first purchase.
All right, we're back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com, and our guest is Robert Spencer from JihadWatch.org. You can check out his website while you're listening to the show. And we're talking about the violence, the political violence that's going on the streets of many major U.S. cities, and even spreading, bleeding out to other places as well. And in fact, if you go to jihadwatch.org, you're going to see there an article called Oakland, Black Lives Matter rioters scream death to America as they start fires and smash cars. You can go and read that on his website again at jihadwatch.org. And Robert, when we hear things like death to America, in my mind, I hear death to America. And that is what we see on the streets of Iran as they're burning the American flag and saying death to America, death to Israel, death to the big Satan, and death to the little Satan, right? That's Israel. So now what is going on here?
In Iran, of course, the Iranians are forced by the regime to scream death to America in the mosques every Friday during Friday prayers. And so it's interesting to note that this leftist jihadist alliance that we were discussing before the break is now becoming explicit with the rioters in America taking up this chant. So do you believe, because I was telling you during the break that if I were one of the leadership of Iran, the Khomeinis, whatever, and I hated America, and we know that their demonstrations are government sponsored. So whatever they're saying on the streets, it's because the government wants them to say it on the streets. And when they're screaming death to America, and they hate America, they hate Donald Trump, they want to see him ousted, and they're trying. I would try to give money to these rebel groups to try to overthrow and weaken the country that I hate. This is if I were
a terrible person. I'm not a terrible person. But do you think that's what's happening? Do you think that Iran or Iranian money, Islamic money, is somehow also being funneled into these movements? BLM, etc., Antifa?
Evidence of that either way, but I think that it's certainly entirely possible. It's worth noting that the Iranian parliament in June, they actually had a session about George Floyd and the protests, at which they chanted "Death to America" in order to show that they were in support of the protests. And the Ayatollah Khamenei has been absolutely delighted and has said now even the Americans are shouting "Death to America." And the Iranians have claimed that now "Death to America" is the slogan of all free-minded and free-spirited people. And recently, the Iranian regime produced an English-language video that shows the destruction of the Capitol and the Washington Monument while saying people everywhere are chanting "Death to America." This is something that the Iranians are absolutely delighted to see, not, of course, the people, but the regime. And it coincides with, it's not just a slogan, it coincides with their international agenda. A few years back, I wrote a book called The Complete Infidel's Guide to Iran. And in that book, I show how the Iranian regime's policy, its foreign policy, is primarily directed around the idea of death to America. It's directed toward weakening America, weakening Israel as America's ally, weakening America's other allies. That's what it's all about. This is not just something that is shouted. This is something that is a core policy of the Iranian regime.
Today, we're hearing about a different kind of terrorism that we're used to, because when we think of terrorists, we think of, many of us at least, think of scraggly, bearded men with keffiyehs on their head, maybe, or some type of head wrap on them, and screaming "Death to America." But today they're talking about domestic terrorism, and I want to know what you have to say about that, and also, again, if you see any ties between the domestic terrorism in America that they're talking about and, is Islamic terrorism.
Well, there's no doubt that with these alliances, with the leftist jihadist alliance, there is coming terrorism. There was actually a woman in Kenosha, Wisconsin, couple weeks ago, as they were burning a flag outside the Kenosha County Courthouse, and she shouted "Death to America." People who were chanting "Death to America" in Oakland, California, were starting fires and smashing cars and buildings as they did it. This is domestic terrorism par excellence. This is the real domestic terrorism, not the kind that is ordinarily imagined by polemicists of the left, where they imagine that there's some huge right-wing threat. This is the real domestic terrorism, which is done by people who have the stated goal of destroying the United States.
So, saying all of this, and you recently wrote an article, and you can people can find it on jihadwatch.org. We haven't seen political violence like this in America since the Civil War. And in this article, you go on to say that the political violence in the USA today is careening toward a second civil war. Explain to our listeners why.
Well, the Civil War, of course, started. The Civil War of 1861 to 1865 came about because of irreconcilable differences between the North and the South in the United States. That is, the North increasingly considered slavery to be a moral evil, and that it should be restricted and ultimately banned altogether. And the South considered that to be a direct challenge to its way of life, and that there was nothing immoral about it, that it was something that was justified even in the Bible, and that consequently the North was simply trying to assert its power at the expense of the South, and that's what its moral indignation about slavery was really all about. And so there was no real reconciliation possible between these two groups. And that's why the war came about. Nowadays, we have the same thing. We have essentially two irreconcilable parties. You could loosely say the supporters of Trump and those who hate Trump. That is the leftist rioters and their supporters, the Democratic Party, and those who support the president. One side is, as I just noted, burning American flags and chanting death to America. The other side loves America, doesn't think it's evil, doesn't think our statues should be torn down, doesn't think we have to be ashamed of our history. Those two sides are irreconcilable. There's no compatibility between them, just as there was no compatibility between the two sides in the Civil War of 1861. So either these things are going to calm down and die down, or there's going to be another civil war. And unfortunately, it looks as if the differences, the divisions in American society today are even greater than they were at the time of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, said that the two sides, the North and the South, prayed to the same God, read the same Bible, and so on. He was saying that the two sides have essentially the same outlook on life, the same values, the same priorities and perspectives. And he was speaking about the larger unity that underlay the divisions. Now, that's true. That was true then, at least. But nowadays, it is not true. The Confederate States of America, when they founded themselves as a separate nation, or as an attempt to be a separate nation, they developed a constitution that was an almost exact copy of the U.S. Constitution, with just a few adjustments. And it was clear that from that Lincoln was right. They held the same values as those of the United States for the most part, with, of course, the notable exception of slavery. And consequently, when they set out to start another country, they made it pretty much like the one they had left. Now, nowadays, if the American left were to form its own country, it would be nothing like the United States. It would not have anything like the American Constitution, and it would not be based on values that were largely the same with a few differences as those of the United States. It would be radically different. It would be likely a Marxist authoritarian state. So all that being the case, the divisions are even larger now than they were then. And I hope that we can avoid conflict, but it's looking to be armed conflict, that is. It's looking to be more difficult to do that all the time.
But Robert, how would that work if geographically everyone is meshed together? I mean, when you had the Civil War, you had the North, and then you had the South. When you have other wars like World War II, you've got Germany, you've got the United States or England, etc. How would this work out in a society where everyone is meshed together?
It would be very ugly. It would be fighting in the streets. There's no doubt that is a big problem nowadays. I mean, you could say roughly there are the so-called red states and blue states, that is, the states that voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 and the states that voted for Trump. But even then, there are quite a few people who voted for one or the other in the states, whichever way the states went. So there would have to be a certain shaking out of that. Probably if a real conflict broke out, there would be a lot of people moving from one area to another. And there would also be a lot of people caught who would be essentially enemies behind the lines. And that's why I say, if this happens, which I certainly hope it doesn't, it's going to be very ugly.
All right, hold it right there. We have to go to a break. We'll be right back.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
All right, we're back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com, and our guest is Robert Spencer from JihadWatch.org, and he's here talking to us about what we are seeing in the United States happening with the political violence on the streets of many major cities, and the chaos, the crime, the looting, the anger, and even the racism. Let me use that word, racism against Jews, against Christians, against Americans, against American values, screaming death to America. And this is not the America that I grew up in, at least, and that many of us listening to the show grew up in, an America that valued freedom, and I can have an opinion, you can have an opinion, and we have to be tolerant and listen to each other. Today, if it's not a law that you can't say certain things, it's peer pressure, and you are shunned, and you are castigated, and you are let go out of work. If you're not towing the PC politically correct lines. And the lines today are to be anti-American because America is an evil colonialist country, and it's a terrible place. But tell that to a lot of people who are trying to get into America because they know it's such a wonderful country and that they can have a bright future there. You work hard, you can make something of yourself. Even a little boy or any little girl who is born in America could grow up and be the president of the United States. This is something that you don't find in many other countries around the world. So Robert Spencer is with us. And Robert, in the last part of the show, we were talking about what's going on in America with possibly enemies of the United States, which we know is Iran, perhaps is assisting in any way they can, whether it's financially, whether it's logistically or whatever. These other hating groups against Americans, like the ANTIFA, like the BLM, who wants to overthrow it. In fact, on the BLM, the Black Lives Matter website, you can see that they state themselves that they're against faith and family. And these are two of the most biggest American values that there are, that, and of course freedom, and we're seeing now the decaying of these values in these major cities, and the working together of these two groups. And talking about that, I want to ask you, Robert, again, you have the liberal California, anything goes, and then against working together and siding with and being understanding and accepting and embracing these radical jihadists. And it just doesn't go together. You've got the gay lifestyle in San Francisco, and you've got Hollywood, which the Islamists hate. They call it a cesspool. They look at Western society and they use Hollywood as a perfect example how Western women dress like prostitutes and they don't stay in their homes, and it's such a terrible, disgusting society. And yet they're working together. So again, where would you like to take us on that point?
I think that's really just the same thing that I said, that it's a shared anti-Americanism, that they have revealed that that's their highest priority. This is not to say that they're going to get along great. If they win, they will no doubt start to fight each other. And we have an example of that in the history of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The Tudeh party was the communist party in Iran before the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And it allied with the Ayatollah Khomeini to overthrow the Shah of Iran. But once the Shah was overthrown, the Tudeh party figured that it would be made part of the government. And instead, Khomeini turned on them and began to imprison and kill them. And so I think this is likely to be what will happen in a state after the leftists and their Islamic allies win, which I, of course, hope does not happen. But if it were to happen, then we're going to see some heavy fighting between the two of them.
Let me ask you this. There's a connection, you were telling me off the air, between Black Lives Matter and Gaza, where the Hamas is. Tell our listeners.
I thought I told you that on the air.
I think that was off the air. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm no doubt misremembering. Anyway, let me find it again. Yeah, in 2015, Black Lives Matter went to Gaza on what was called supposedly a solidarity trip. And they studied the supposed link between Israeli atrocities and the atrocities committed by American police. And Sherelle Brown, who was one of the activists on the trip, said, so many parallels exist between how the U.S. polices, incarcerates, and perpetuates violence on the black community, and how the Zionist state that exists in Israel perpetuates the same on Palestinians. This is not to say there aren't vast differences and nuances that need to be always named, but our oppressors are literally collaborating together, learning from one another, and as oppressed people, we have to do the same. And there doesn't seem to be any sign that has been reversed or retracted or reconsidered since then. It seems likely that they are actually working together.
Yeah, and I remember that you were talking before about the tumbling down of statues. And I remember seeing clips of Nancy Pelosi saying, well, if people don't want to have statues like that in their city, they have if they want to take them down, then that's their business. But, you can't just take, if you want to, this is the whole thing. There's no law and order with the left today, because if you want to have a statue taken down in your city, you bring it up to the city council. You have a democratic vote. You don't just go in as a mob and tumble something down that taxpayers paid for and are supporting. So again, it's a chaotic thing like in Gaza and other Islamic regimes where there is no law and order. There's only the law that the strong one has, those who are in power, and there's no rights and there's no due process. There's nothing like that. So that's worrying in itself. And let me just get your website, because we're coming to the end of the show. We only have about 3 minutes left. You are the head of jihadwatch.org. On Wikipedia and other places, they describe your website as anti-Islamic counter-jihad movement on the internet. So I would like you to counter that if you want to. And tell us what the purpose and the goals are of jihadwatch.org and why people should be going to visit your website.
Jihad Watch is a news and commentary organization designed to shed light on the motivating ideology behind jihad terror. We post at jihadwatch.org every day news of that jihad activity in the United States and Israel and around the world. And we show what the derivation of or justification for this behavior is in Islamic teachings and texts. This is something that the establishment media ignores or downplays or denies altogether. And thus, the service that we provide is to show what is really going on and what the ideological bases of it, things that are all too often covered up nowadays.
Okay, and so with all of this and with all we've talked about, we're trying to warn Americans today that there may be outside influences. I mean, the Democratic Party is always screaming Russia intervention. They're intervening in our affairs, but here we see perhaps that the Islamists or Iran or other outside groups are also intervening in American politics. As you just said, BLM was getting trained in Gaza. Why are they going outside of America to be trained by terrorists in Gaza? And so what can Americans do about it? Now that we know all of this information, what should we be doing? What do we need to do?
Well, there's so much misinformation and disinformation in American society today about these issues that the main thing we need to do is sound the alarm, call attention to these things in whatever fora we have available to us, show people that Black Lives Matter is a slogan that nobody could disagree with, but that behind it is an organization with a quite frankly insidious agenda, and that consequently nobody who loves America or loves a free society should be supporting it.
All right. So basically you're telling people just to go to websites, read up, be aware, have your antenna up, realize who people are so you know what side you want to go on. Basically, that's what you're saying?
Well, yeah, and we have to be activists ourselves. Nobody's going to do this for us. And so we have to understand that if we don't stand up and become active in fighting for freedom today, then we are going to lose that freedom. That there's no other alternative. There's no army that's going to take care of this or other people who are going to take care of this. It's on us.
And as I've often talked about on my show, that the people say, well, we've got the Constitution will protect us, but we all know that the Constitution is only as strong as the people willing to go out and defend it and fight for it. So, all right. So with that, we'll end the show. And I want to thank you very, very much, Robert Spencer, for coming on. You can follow Robert on Twitter. How do they find you on Twitter, Robert?
Jihad Watch RS.
Jihad Watch RS. RS stands for?
Robert.
Spencer. Okay, of course. There you go. Okay. So Jihad Watch RS, and you can follow him on Twitter. You can go to jihadwatch.org. And if you have any comments or questions, feel free to write me, Tamar, Tamar, at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Any comments you have, I'll be happy to forward to Robert Spencer if you want to write in. And thank you for listening. And keep, again, we are here in order to bring on different voices, to make you aware of what's going on, and to let you have the opportunity to have critical thinking. Again, Robert Spencer, thank you for being with us.
Pleasure. Thank you.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling for the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.